The interesting thing that is about music is that it's a set of languages that are not obviously representational. It's not clear basically what music represents. Instead, you have intrinsic rules that describe a space. And in that space, you can have objects. And these objects are of a perceptual nature. And you can basically look at the way of the functions that are computing the sound in your mind and that are producing the regularity, the higher levels of the sound that you perceive as rhythm or as cadence or as the structures of the musical phrases that are being used, that can be used like textures or that can be used like and what we find, for instance, is that there seems to be some super interesting isomorphism between the space of emotions and the space of musical expressions on some level, right? So it's possible to create music that is almost directly producing emotional states in people. And you can use this as a language to describe emotion. And not just emotion, but attitudes. So you can have music that feels almost as if it is a narrative that describes a sequence of attitudes that an agent or a group of agents goes through. And it's very interesting to observe how that works, right? So you can use music in a representational way. And it's being used as a language in movies. Right? Composers have even developed this language and trained their audience to respond to particular parts better than they would do that in their native state. And it's interesting how it's possible that music can convey emotion without having this direct reference. Right? There seems to be something going on here where the internal representation that the brain is using to describe music and the representation that it uses to describe emotion are extremely similar. The potential of music in this regard is probably not completely exhausted. For instance, I am wondering whether it would be possible to use music as a language to describe geometry. Geometry can be described as, for instance, the skeleton of objects, which you could describe as the differences in distribution of mass in space. And you could have changes in objects, for instance, in the momentum or in the relative distances to each other, express this with dimensions in the music. So you could have, for instance, sounds at different pitches that change in volume, or you could have changes between such sounds and so on. And once you establish a referential meaning, you basically learn that language, you should be able to have a type of music that is describing geometries. Changing geometries, objects in space that are moving and interacting and changing. And if you would entrain yourself with such a language, it would mean that you hear a piece of music in that language, and a very complicated pitched language that has many instruments, more complicated than you can easily produce with your own voice. But by hearing that, you would, in your mind's eye, see a scene playing out, these geometries playing out, right? That would be a language that you have to learn, and that would be a music that in principle is so rich that it's able to describe complicated spatial events in a much more concise and precise way than spoken language can do it. And maybe this type of language already exists, and I've just never heard about this type of music. I wouldn't be surprised. I'm always late to the party. But if not, somebody should invent it. And would lead to a very interesting musical genre. And it would also, I think, be super useful to have a community of speakers of a geometric music language. And you could use this for arbitrary domains. You could talk about developments, say, on the financial markets across many dimensions using such a language. So you could have this auditory channel to convey arbitrary things in the world. And music is unconstrained from the relationship to the larger body of meaning that you have in natural language. Natural language is mostly interesting when you have established relationship between the conceptual space to which linguistic concepts point and the mental simulations that lie behind the conceptual space. And because music does not have this tight reference, it can create its own mathematical subuniverses that are disconnected from the world at large. And part of that is what makes music interesting, but it's also the reason why it's interesting to uninteresting to a lot of people, because it does not have to mean anything. It can be just patterns, and some people find it delightful and delicious to start at patterns and unravel structure and discover structure in it, and others find it annoying and distracting because they have other stuff to think about.